Well, let's now discuss the latest developments further with Dr. Mathew Benson. He is a Sudan and South Sudan director at the Conflict in the Research Program at the London School of Economics. Now, Sudan, great to have you on the show with us, Dr. Benson. Now, Sudan's military leader has now dissolved that transitional cabinet and, of course, the Sovereign Council, which we know is the joint military and civilian body leading the country. He has also suspended constitutional articles that were meant to guide that transitional period post the Bashir era. So what does this bode for the country's progress towards democracy and elections in 2023?
I think a lot of this will come down to the way that the international community and to the way that the government of Sudan listens to the civilian protesters who are still peacefully protesting on the ground. And it's actually could potentially result in richer discussions about the country's economic situation. As we know, the situation on the ground has been terrible for most Sudanese, and there's a real push and necessity for the government to be able to demonstrate quick wins that can help the transition go, actually demonstrate the meaning of the transition in people's lives in a more clear manner. So I actually see this as an opportunity for the actual aims of the revolution, which were always about a more meaningful democratic transition and weren't necessarily about the government still being led by the military, for those aims to actually be realized. So it's actually an opportunity for the international community as well as for the government to pay attention to those concerns rather than fall back into the same patterns that we've seen in Sudan for the past 60 years, and under British occupation, similar patterns also existed.
Well, let's talk about how the coup drew global condemnation. The U.S. has now halted about $700 million in aid. Also, the UN Security Council will be meeting today, or they met today to discuss the crisis in Sudan. What are your expectations in terms of their response and suddenly the prospects of normalizing ties, Sudan normalizing ties with the international community?
Now is probably one of the most critical moments the international community could ever, their engagement is needed now more than ever. And it's also a time, again, to reframe how the international community has been engaging with Sudan. The IMF reforms that have been going on in the country have actually pushed for a lot of the for the removal of subsidies that have actually contributed to the economic crisis, which contributed to the whole crisis is related to this economic situation. And without this resolved, and without actually thinking through more clearly how the international community can actually aid this transition, either through some sort of mechanism that by multilateral and bilateral assistance can help the country generate quick wins that support a democratic transition and shift away from the country's increasing sway or pull towards the Gulf countries, which have their own agenda, which are not democratic for those on the ground. So it's a chance for a more meaningful actually listening to those who are on the ground who are protesting and actually pushing for a peaceful democratic transition for that to take place. So I see this again as an opportunity to actually achieve the full demands of the revolution that have been pushed for us in late 2018, early 2019. The question is how do you get those over? And it means doing things that it's not necessarily business as usual. And I think there's a real push for innovation, and a very rapid response to this is desperately needed. I'm optimistic that that might be possible because people see that how the risks of the economic situation, if they still continue to deteriorate in people's lives, then you can see how this provides openings for non-democratic elements to actually continue their push for self-enrichment rather than actually trying to help the majority of people improve their lives, which is desperately needed in the country.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what this means for the country's economy, because Prime Minister Hamdok had actually began to implement a number of economic reforms. But since this coup, as a result of that showdown between the military and the people, airports, businesses are all closed. Central bank staff have gone on strike, and doctors refuse to work in military-run hospitals. Now, for a country that was already in a deep economic crisis, how bad could this get?
The situation was already bad for most Sudanese. So I think one needs to look at this more critically. What I worry about is potential for more regional political marketplaces to be shaped by the gap or the opening that this provides. I mean, so really there's a challenge over raising enough revenue that actually can support, again, the democratic transition and how this can be done in a meaningful way. So I think the situation is already it's already there for most. It's already the whole reason that this revolution took place was again over the fact that fuel and bread were too expensive for ordinary people. So I don't see this as something where the situation necessarily deteriorates more. What I see more is the risk of increased fragmentation in Sudan over non-democratic elements in the country and increased being able to increase regional tensions and that the center can no longer hold. So you can see this in Red Sea and in eastern parts of Sudan. And that's the major risk here is how do you actually build an economic bargain that holds the country together and actually, again, supports a democratic transition and listens to those who are on the ground, who are actually trying and already thinking through very innovative ways in which to change the way that the state works for them and actually change the way that local and economies are working. And I think those are it really provides a chance for innovation rather than one of kind of doomsday type thinking. So I would actually challenge the idea that things will necessarily get worse. Now is the moment to reimagine everything. And we're already seeing on the ground that Sudanese are helping all of us see the ways in which it can be reimagined. This is not business as usual, and people are refusing to adhere to the same logics that have led us down this path in the first place. That gives us cause for hope, and we should be able to try our best to support that.
Well, on that note, there actually have been a number of previous coup attempts since that agreement between the civilian and military leaders was signed back in 2019. What does this coup and, of course, the previous coup attempts reveal about the strength of that agreement and possibly how they should move going forward?
It reveals what we always knew. We always knew that the economic considerations that actually contributed to the revolution taking place in the first place were not seriously enough considered within the economic bargain or the political bargain that was struck. Again, I think this is a real opportunity to, if we're able to support a democratic transition, as everyone hopes is sincerely possible in the country, then this is actually a chance to reframe what this means and how do you actually remove the non-democratic elements in the state, which are not interested in how you make everyone's lives better. They're more interested in self-enrichment. So if you're able to actually challenge this and call this out and reduce the threat and show that they are not representing the will of the people, they're representing their own interests. And that's what these protests, as far as I understand, are mostly about and need to still be supported. So the legacy of coups is actually one that should give us hope that you can see on the ground that people are so frustrated with this, that they are still refusing to let this to lie down whilst this happens. It's now in a critical moment, and I'd like to see more support given towards those on the ground who are trying to prevent this from happening yet again.